All right, folks. Thank you for coming. This is also being recorded, so for those who are listening, this is the first of a series, provisionally, well, not no longer provisional, but now called Resisting Nationalism. But I think it's a very loose pitch around nationalism. It'll be a three-part series. We'll commence with Gargi Bhattacharyya. It'll be followed by Kojo Koram later on in the month, and then sometime July, Richard Seymour and his forthcoming book, Disaster Nationalism, hotly awaited. But of course, thank you for all coming. I think many of you will know who Gargi is. Gargi Bhattacharyya, still of UAL.
Yes.
Yes. There's only one letter that changes in this in the transition. I am Sivamohan Vallu, but most people call me Vallu. This isn't really about me, but they've very kindly put my book here, but that is grotesquely dated.
That's not true.
But this one, we're focusing loosely on Futures of Racial Capitalism. I said we're going to pitch it a little more around nationalism, however, to bring in a slightly more global remit, speculative discussion. So I'll do a little spiel initially. Well, my spiels are very rarely little and tend to get quite garbled, but nonetheless, I'll do a little spiel about the book, but kind of pitch it a little more towards some concerns or speculative remarks about how much nationalism can explain, and perhaps other things are also afoot. Gargi will do her characteristically colorful riff off that, and then hopefully we'll have some, I think Gargi in particular, I am too, but not by disposition, but by principle, want everyone to be involved. Gargi, by disposition and principle, will ensure that everyone's involved. And I mean, I don't know all of you here, but obviously a few of you I know.
Strictly participatory.
That's right. I know some of you, and of those whom I know you probably have even wiser remarks to say on these matters than I do. So it will be great if people can partake. So I'll do a little spiel on the book, but also why I think I appreciate the book and why it speaks to our concerns today. But actually, to be honest, I think those of you, firstly, you ought to buy it, obviously. But I think in spite of the complexity, the content, the sophistication, I actually think it's always worthwhile stressing something about Gargi's style and temperament when it comes to writing, let alone speaking. And there's something about the book which is characterized by this remarkably recursive style, this method of doubt and circling back, eschewing confidence in favor of actually thinking, not avoiding strong claims for its own sake, and actually not trying to grandstand. And these are, of course, those of you who know Gargi will know these are profound virtues that they bring to bear. But quite frankly, they can sometimes feel quite anachronistic virtues. Certainly, I think what we're trying to do today is really think anew. I don't mean because we're trying to be original, but rather try to think about what is novel about the things and the problems that we are reckoning with and contending with. And that doesn't invite easy pontification. Of course it doesn't. But unfortunately, people like me, and maybe some of my peers too, we find it very easy to pontificate regardless and just grandstand for its own sake. And I think it is through knowing Gargi, actually, it's always instructive for people like me, but I'm sure for people like you too, that there is something extremely instructive in just slowing down, actually asking questions. A lot of half of the paragraphs end with, well, I don't know quite what I'm thinking, but maybe it might be like this, or it could plausibly be like that. And that's a very humbling and important way of trying to reckon with these questions. And actually, the book, in taking racism and capitalism as its kind of dual concerns, it refuses to suggest a causal primacy. I think you even refuse to some extent to suggest a necessity of that very relationship. But instead it opts for some kind of a sense of like a messy elective affinity, if you like. And when I say elective affinity, that's unfortunately a very Max Weber concept. I mean, I know, unfortunately, I amongst, and nobody else, still dwell amongst the crusty dead white men of the 19th century. So it's still Durkheim and Weber who kind of just come to bear when I'm trying to improvise. But there is a messy elective affinity there between the two logics of differentiation. That is to say, capitalism as a differentiating machine and racism as a differentiating machine. Of course, 21st century capitalism and its distinctive differentiations do, to use a wonderful phrase that recurs in the book, do certainly squat in the divisions of previous eras of racial capitalism. But what Gargi does for racial capitalism and as analysis, I think, is actually akin to what someone like Raymond Williams, who remains important for many of us, I think perhaps for you too, when he counseled that we always need to account for simultaneously the dominant, of course, but also the emergent and also the residual. That all three motors of history are in some kind of conjunctural interaction and are often actually doing quite separate and certainly often quite contradictory things. In that sense, I do think much of what is presented, and not all, but much, and it's not a critique, but it's owing to its just sheer popularity and ubiquity now, but much of what passes for racial capitalism analysis can often seem to only attend to the residual, where the racial of the past, the capitalist past, is seen as explaining the shape of the racial of the capitalist present. Sorry, I don't know if that was a mouthful, but whatnot. In contrast, what Gargi does so compellingly is, in fact, I think, refuse the false analytic comforts of mere historical continuity. After all, historical materialism, if as a method, piqued your attention. I mean, we're in Houseman's after all, and I gather all of you will be some stripe or shade of red, I assume. Commiserations for that too, but but what is that as a method, if it is not an attentiveness to permanent capitalist reinvention, permanent capitalist innovation, what Weber again calls that peculiarly restless energy that characterizes capitalism, this incessant breaching of thresholds, what Harvey calls capital can't abide a limit. And as such, if the value of the beast, really, the monster of value scraping, a term you use throughout, profit, I suppose, or accumulation, if the beast of profit is so incessantly protean, some of us, when we were all Marxists, we used to say all that is solid melts into air. It's a lovely phrase that I haven't heard for a while, so I'll use it myself. But if that is in fact the case, then it becomes... What's interesting is precisely what is different about contemporary mechanisms of differentiation. If we do want to say something speculatively meaningful, not merely about the present, but not least about the future. Of course, Gargi, and I would like to say me too. I'm from Sri Lanka, as it happens. So, but we are still we are still attentive to the continuous racial and colonial horrors that's bequeathed to us by a Western arrest economic geography. But still, I think what I find so refreshingly original about how you try to enter these questions is actually trying to stake out those more novel features of today's actually perhaps more globally dispersed and reconfigured forms of capitalist differentiation, and how it might, but also how it might not relate to race and racism, or for our purposes today, how it might or might not relate to nation and nationalism, or how it might or might not relate to the previous clarity of a more bounded sense of a global north vis-a-vis a more bounded unitary sense of a global south, a dependency, and all of that kind of typologized in a neat binary. I think, for instance, there are so many chapters I would recommend. The two closing ones are more rhetorically beautiful, inviting. The platform capitalism one, which we might touch upon later. But for our purposes, the chapter on bordering, it raises extraordinarily important questions, interesting questions about how various transnationally collaborative bordering assemblages are proliferating across various global nodes. Assemblages of bordering that are it's not only about repelling the wretched who are left to die, but then folds in select others into the labor force, crucially, however, as something less than wage laborers, via employer-sponsored dependencies. There's been a lot in the news lately about the care sector, but I suspect it's obviously a more diffuse feature of our economy more broadly, via fixed visa stipulations, via seasonal conditionality, or via the dormitories and labor encampments proliferating across our kind of often quite invisible or faintly understood rural farms or offshore fisheries, etc., etc. And I was actually speaking at a different event a couple of months ago, Sita Balani, whose book you should also buy. They're also exemplary thinker. Though I'd forget what it's called. Deadly and Slick. There we are. But, Sita was typically irreverent and funny about something quite morbid, I have to say. But, she was talking about actually these soft fruit farm picking entrepreneurs, the types who you'll find in the Kents and Hertfordshire of this world. And actually, these entrepreneurs, they're kind of quite enthusiastic embrace of post-Brexit migrant labor arrangements. And she focuses on a particular Christine Snell of Hertfordshire vintage. This Christine Snell was remarkably brazen, refreshingly candid, really, about expressing her preference for the post-Brexit work visa arrangements, quote unquote, because the worker is stuck. The worker cannot compete for other wages elsewhere, and so on and so forth. And importantly, I suppose the crux here for me, anyways, for our purposes today, in part, is that these innovations of a post-liberal kind of migrant labor arrangement or migrant labor regime, I say post-liberal because its most ardent proponents themselves declare it as post-liberal. That is to say, they argue that a much more efficient and coherently nationalist presentation of dealing with immigration, both as asylum as workers, would require a much more sovereignist disentangling of any liberal baggage from the 20th century. Liberal baggage as norms, liberal baggage as constitutional features, liberal baggage as kind of international conventions, if you like. And they argue that a much more nationalist assertion is pure sovereignty, would require us to unlearn any liberal compromises or complications. And they argue that we would stand to learn from other parts of the world or other more increasingly prominent centers of capitalist power. By that, I mean that they argue that these innovations are just as likely to arise in the Gulf states or the ASEAN nations, that is, Southeast Asian nations, maybe East Asia, so on and so forth, as it is likely to be innovated in rural Kent. I mean, nothing's really innovated in rural Kent, but I mean, was it Malcolm said it was the armpit of England? But or be even innovated by the EU, the instruments of the EU or Frontex more broadly. And indeed, I was actually streaming this weekend, though I should find better things to do, I suppose. But I was streaming this weekend that tamasha about Cedric Robinson being, not Berkeley, but it was at Santa Barbara, I think. And the great and the good and all the luminaries were there, of course. But what's interesting, like people like Ruthie Gilmore and a couple others, they were just like quite insistent that we must think of global hubs of capital concentration and middle-class consumer formation as networks now across various global nodes, wherein a global north-south distinction is no longer self-evident in explaining the economic governing innovations, but also cruelties alike, that we need to broaden and complicate the geography and contextual or context of the national instruments of the capitalist engine as they're dispersed across this disparate network, and how innovations therein are diffused across these hubs in pretty remarkable ways. And it's not always England to Singapore, it's often increasingly Singapore to England, or the Gulf to Europe, and however it may be. Quinn Slobodian is also really good. I'm going to just promote every book I see. So then by the end of this, you'll buy every book in Houseman's, as we all should do. Now, I'm sorry, I mean, this has become a little technical, but I actually think we could be a bit more colorful for a Friday afternoon or evening. But there is maybe a slightly more left-wing oriented point here as well, insofar I think it is important for left-wing conversations to sometimes de-exceptionalize Britain. To de-exceptionalize Britain in terms of its own nationalist frenzy and its own endless multiplying preoccupation with the false catharsis of bordering, where sometimes we too can get involved in a kind of inversely nationalist parochialism, where by ascribing to this, albeit peculiar island, but ascribing to this peculiar island a kind of unique set of cruel Britannia politics, that somehow we are so bad, and it's all to do with our colonial legacies, histories, and aftermaths, and so on and so forth. That is to say, we often make it seem that our violences and our problems are singularly and perhaps even gloriously British, which ironically is to do a particular kind of nationalism itself, albeit nationalism as critique. When in fact the sort of bordering fetish that we're talking about today is of course proliferating everywhere. Of course it's proliferating, and that, by that sense of bordering, I mean it in two senses. Of course, that spectacular sadism, the sadism of Rwanda, the sadism of Bibi Stockholm, the sadism of the wholesale curtailment of the very possibility of asylum to this country. I say that as someone whose father was an asylum seeker. Via him, there were some implications for me too. Via the sadism of deportations, and via even it doesn't seem to me entirely plausible that an emboldened and triumphant and Keir Starmer, drunk on a sense of patriotism, it's not entirely implausible that he might even launch some kind of grand naval blockade of the English Channel, and you can only imagine the morbid kind of kitsch, hammy, revivalist Churchillianism that will suddenly, all the fanfare, and of course many of us will think it obscene and absurd, but one fears that there is a certain kind of recipe for success that lurks in that kitschness, if you like. So of course there is that spectacular sadism, but we're also talking about, secondly, bordering as those governing technologies, where we see certain legal instruments expand in a much more avowedly post-liberal way, where people are shipped in and out of this country or any other country, but crucially as only and exclusively as workers, and workers who reside in a spectrum of unfreedoms, where you cannot even obtain any residual rights, and where what might have some kind of accrued economic mobility or just geographic mobility itself is no longer permitted in the way that we might otherwise assume could obtain by mere virtue of accessing a space or a territory that we otherwise call a nation. And naturally, of course, this kind of premise is going to expand across the world mammoth-fold, owing to all this kind of natalist talks of demographic collapses and imbalances and so on and so on. We're even seeing it in places like Poland, ironically enough, given that we think of that as a nation that provides immigrants, if you like, where the ratio of citizens to workers are increasingly going to get shorter and shorter. But even places like China, where currently apparently a working age population of 1 billion is likely to fall to 230, 250 million within 50 to 100 years. I mean, in some ways we can't no longer do the longue durée, but the planet might be scorched and fried by then. And some of these things become moot, perhaps, but we can maybe talk about those things too. But I actually think sometimes it's these slightly small city-states or these slightly anomalous states that become a harbinger and portent of what is more likely. So the Gulf states, something like Singapore, which is perhaps doesn't seem instructive, but when you actually think of Singapore, that half its population, half its employed population lives in a migrant conditionalized relationship to work. There is no reason why Britain shouldn't try to do something likewise. It might be drunk on its own civilizationism, its own sense of kind of slightly contradictory claims to liberalism and so on, but fundamentally, like Douglas Carswell and so on, were pretty candid about this before once upon a time. It's kind of softened a little bit of late, but whatnot. I probably talked too long, but what we also want to do today is maybe therein we'll explore other things, but maybe it's not only nationalism that is going to couch all these problems, and maybe the arrival of the platform economy and certain tech affordances also kind of almost virtualize territory in certain ways, that we don't need these meta-categories, that actually every individual will be hyper-surveilled as a data node, and the nation or even the state in that way becomes slightly redundant. Or we might think of it as purely supranational things, like actually these are supranational architectures where various forces of capital arrange kind of nodes of fixity come mobility as they see fit. Or, in many ways, I talk a lot about China, obviously, but maybe later on we can visit. Sometimes these distinctions are very much internal to a nation. One of the biggest migrant formulations in relation to work is in China. And they are both sinicized populations. That is, they're both seen as Han Chinese, but one is declared migrant laborer and one is seen as the urban citizen. And the urban citizen has access to all sorts of rights, welfare support, educational and health resources, quite well funded. And the migrant worker sits outside of that despite largely residing in the city and working in the city, but they don't have allowance or access to those very affordances. And crucially, though both are Chinese, they're vernacularized in the popular imagination as migrant. And it almost becomes a pseudo-identity. So there's fascinating things that we can think about there, insofar as sometimes when the anti-immigration nationalist brigade in Britain remember some of their neoliberal working class shaming idioms, then they go, oh, less immigration, let's discipline the hell out of this idle class that is sitting on incapacity benefits and so on. So we can see different ways in which intra-distinctions from within the nation too can be purposed in ways that I think are fairly novel. So I don't know, a lot to discuss, but yeah, Gargi?
Okay, right. So first I should say thank you so much for coming. Secondly, I should say, as people who know me already know, I can't ever really remember what I wrote in the past, because I already, and probably other people in the room who write know that. So you write like this to get this turmoil out of your head, and then get some sleep as it's gone, and then the next thing comes. So it's quite hard for me to remember what is in this particular set of sleepless nights. So I'll try and tell you some things about it, and hopefully then we'll have a big conversation. So Vallu is always very, very kind about the way I write, but which I really appreciate. I don't think other people think that. But I've become increasingly almost in a almost paralysing way, anxious about how very hard it is to know anything at all about the world, the horror of the world around us and as it emerges. I certainly have very extreme doubts about the kind of analytic and educational trainings that I've undertaken. I've been quite an interdisciplinary person because I chased the question, and yet still, even though I've ranged quite widely across the ways in which both the humanities and social sciences in Britain, in English, have been taught and learnt, I just feel clueless. So I think there's something about, what is it to know the world? What have we got? What can we share? How can we say to each other that the challenge of knowing the world is still a challenge of not even yet to change it, just to survive? And I know some of you who I know already reside 1 foot in, 1 foot out of the university, and I don't know some of you, but so I don't want to cast any aspersions on you. But I think it is becoming. It's already become obvious, so serious people are kind of looking inside and outside, that the kinds of forms of institutionalised education are in no way focused on the kinds of challenges that we face as a species or a planet, or even just as a local people. I just kind of say that so we could have a different kind of chat as you've given up your Friday evening, because that feels like, if I can be in a room with 25 people who I like, that is a conversation that I think is worth having. Like, okay, what are we trying to know and for what purpose? So I did try. It's a bit of a virtue of necessity. I've had to come to quite painful realisation that I will never be a respectable scholar. It's too late now. There's no time left for me to become that thing. And I understand that means amongst my peers it's a bit of sniffiness. But in my head, I think, some of the things about respectable scholarship and even the traditions of the more organised left have, as you've said, pushed us to speak when you can make the very, very certain declaration. And as if you can shut up everyone else in the room, then you won that, as if that takes us a step further. And both the academy and actually the left in many of its formations does that. I did that for decades. So, oh yes, shut everyone else up there, that means we won. I think, oh no, that was just terrible. Mm-hmm. So now I'm trying to think of ways of writing where I'm just very upfront about the limits of my own knowledge. So instead of telling you the thing I know certainly, I'm trying to show you how I'm trying to edge up to the end of what I know, so that others who know the next thing or the thing that interfaces onto that might bring some of the other pieces. And I'm still trying that out, and I'd really like to hear from people what they think, what could be our ways of learning to think together in that way. But I can't imagine that we will have a sufficiently serious intellectual project unless we give up on the idea that we will, any one of us, tell the truth or make the intervention. That was what, make the serious intervention. You go away and your comrades say, that's a great intervention. Oh, they look terrible. What was that about? And instead to say, well, look, this is quite a troubling and difficult time to know. There's some things we know easily, so easily that we don't need to fight about them. And then some other things that still seem to me very, very difficult just even to narrate. I can't even describe them, let alone then tell you what our politics is about them. So I'm just trying to get to the point, I think this stuff is happening. What does someone else think? I think there's a lot of people like me who are broadly trained across, what might have been seen before as the liberal arts. There's good reason for that in this country. It's because of the ways in which the neoliberal project presented itself in this country, the ways in which Thatcherism sought to change the hearts and minds of the country and operated through a whole set of discursive formations. So it wasn't altogether stupid for my generation to think, well, they're the places we need to learn to intervene. I used to talk to a good friend of mine who's a social worker, and our kids would laugh and say, look, the planet is burning and you lot, all you can do is do a risk assessment and write an essay. What kind of bollocks is this? And I was like, oh yeah, but when we were learning that was where the violence of the state was coming. So we're trying to learn those things. So it's not about guilt. It's just that the enemy shows itself differently, and we need to keep up with that. So trying to get my aid memoir to myself. So I am a bit embarrassed that my work still now reads like a kind of the work of an excitable amateur, but really, I'd like to persuade you all to join me in that kind of happy amateurism rather than... And I'll just say it again, because things are so serious. The other side are on the move, and they've made it clear that all of our lives are dispensable, expendable, right in front of us. And so unless we build some collaborative ways of knowing what is happening and what must be done, I don't see that we're going to make it. So I started in this book, with what I was trying to understand about some big puzzles of our time. One set is a set of puzzles about what, if anything, anymore is the state, what's still done in the name of the state, and how might it be done. And alongside that, something that seems too poncy to say, oh, look, what happens to practices of accumulation, but really to think about, how does capital remake itself? I was thinking, why do I always say value scraping? And of course, because I'm also uncertain about the role of work and labour now. So most of the language that you learn from, everyone can see I'm, grown up in Marxism. I still think I'm a Marxist. I don't know. The reasons why I think about value scraping is because those languages of labour might not work if we're not strictly labouring. So it's like just some euphemism that will allow us to talk about the many ways that capital steals our life force for now, and we might move into some other things. So I try to think about prisons and borders. It's like, what do states do now? They definitely do now. They might not do welfare, they might not even build infrastructure, but certainly a lot of incarceration and a lot of bordering. And how is capital remaking itself? Maybe not always by employing us, but certainly by making us indebted. Indebtedness seems like a more, not uniform, but a more kind of widespread global experience than wagedness. If standard wagedness is only about a quarter of the world, indebtedness is loads more than that, different forms of indebtedness, and alongside indebtedness, platformisation. Because what shape does capital take? What shape does capital take when it moves around the world? So that's what the book tries to say. Oh, look, I don't quite know about any of those four things, but maybe we could start to push forward on those. And they're all sketched in the most provisional of ways. Now, I know Vallu wants us to talk about bordering, so I'll say a bit about bordering and then end with a little bit about work, non-work, and then we can talk. Again, probably because I'm also really embarrassed about having become so parochially British as I've got older. I know I am internationalist in my spirit, but actually in my practice, I'm just obsessed with this space. This is the space I was born and brought up in. This is where my family live. This is where any street politics I'm involved in is in this broader space, in this country. And so my preoccupations of how we understand the violences of the world come back to the British street. I try to write in a way that we can think of the British street alongside other vernacular spaces, but really this is the one I know. And as people who live here will sadly realise that we've had at least 2.5, 3 decades of quite explicit jingoistic anti-migrant politics from all major parties, from street movements, from the popular media. And understandably, then a whole load of us have spent time saying, oh, well, this is a nationalist discourse. This is how you mobilise a populist nationalism. This is how electoral politics uses the repertoire of popular nationalism to make an authoritarian austerity or something like that, which makes sense in terms of how Britain works. But I've increasingly started to think, well, partly, as you say, firstly, there's nothing very British about this. So, everywhere is doing it. So, what if you start in Britain, then you kind of just see their flavours, whereas what if you started somewhere else and said, oh, everyone is doing this? And equally, states are not doing this on their own. So even though there might be a kind of vernacular racism as borders are explained within national spaces, so like we hate this lot of foreigners for this reason, depending on who we are and how we fictionalise our history, in terms of what happens to people who fall out of the contract of citizen, non-citizen, migrant, non-migrant, those things largely happen through collaboration across state entities. Quite a lot of them now happen by a kind of either explicit or tacit agreement of spaces beyond anyone's responsibility. Like people get stuck in the camp or the bit in between, the corridor. I started to write loads about corridors, so I better stop. But the idea that there are spaces beyond anyone's responsibility and beyond any kind of legal redress. Not that legal redress works for bordering, but it matters when states, to express their sovereignty, say, oh, but our sovereignty doesn't mean these places, and if I can just get you into these places, my business is done. And to do that collaboratively across, as you say, ASEAN has quite a similar set of arrangements, different bits. What I have to say next is just slogans, but slogans is all right. It's this is like a meeting as well as a book thing, isn't it? So really, I think that even if these techniques, they're in movement, we need to stop focusing a lot of our migrant justice conversation on the bad jingoism of the nationalist. I want to milkshake people as much as anyone else, so people should have their fun. But that is not the thing. I think people understand that that's the theatre of it. The violence of the border is happening through some other machineries, and that needs us not to think, oh, we're challenging bad jingoism. I think it's also a difference between thinking that our job as people who try and think about and understand the world and intervene in it is at a kind of ideas discursive level, and is not something about understanding operational practices. So it's, again, I'm telling myself off that I've been involved probably nearly every year, possibly for the last 35 years, in some kind of project that is meant to change people's minds about migration. Tell the truth about migration, give voice to migrants, myth bust. All of those things were absolutely honourable projects, structured in good faith in response to a very violent street and state racism. And yet, they barely touch the surface of what the real violence against migrants is, which is not the popular racism of I hate you because you're a foreigner, but to live in a global structure where some people are being made just expendable, and to be marked migrant is one of those expendabilities. So that's one thing I'd like us to talk about. And we had this thing when we were doing WhatsApp about, last time we did this was before COVID, and we had this little talk about antinationalism. So I still think that. I think that we should not only embrace, we should celebrate and articulate and build a very explicitly anti-nationalist politics. Like anti-nationalism should be the couple to internationalism. It's hard to say that in this country, but we should kind of, first you say it, then you can do it. And now I think today's one is that alongside that, we should celebrate and articulate and build a different way of thinking about the anti-citizen as the fully formed creature of an anti-nationalist politics. Again, because I'm the age I am and endlessly hopeful, I've been involved in all kinds of things where implicitly the idea is how you combat bordering is that you try to expand the terms of citizenship. again, tactically, I think that is right. Because lots of things you do tactically, but you also need to talk about, well, so what is a tactic and what is really the whole understanding? As we're seeing a different disruption and dismantling of what citizenship can be, and actually a decoupling from some ideas about migration. We're not the only place that is engaging in citizenship stripping or making citizenship conditional, or trying to be, which is a bigger state shift. We need to find some other ways to say to each other, not that there is an equilibrium where there's a normal nation and then there's people cast outside it, we're trying to get them in, but instead that there is a world of violence and people are falling on different sides of where that violence is. How do we articulate what a shared humanity is? So that's one bit. And linked to that is why platforms. Platforms, I feel like, I don't know anything about platforms even now. I'm just kind of, and I feel embarrassed because people really work on platforms. A lot of the people I know who work on platforms work on the experience of working within the platform economy, which is a very important one segment of it. The bit that I'm really trying to learn, haven't learnt yet, is not only what it feels like to work within the platform economy, but what it means when the biggest global corporations are platform corporations, and therefore what global capital is echoes the form of the platform. Now that feels to me like we're just at the first decade of that, but that's something that might mean something different. And the thing that I try to talk about in the book is that it seems to me that we're already in a moment where what is needed to remake capital is no longer congruent with with patterns of human settlement, of what it is needed to remake human life. We live as we do in the kind of patterns of settlement across the globe because of a slightly earlier moment of capitalist reproduction. That's the city, isn't it? And it's also different kinds of concentration of capital. And then capital comes to a kind of accommodation with us as we fight back and says, okay, you can have a bus and some water and those kinds of things. That patterning seems to me in quite serious crisis in many parts of the world, even here, but let alone in kind of bigger mass populations, that how capital is remaking itself doesn't seem to map easily onto the infrastructure of any other recent phase of industrialisation. And that is leaving us, without water coming out the tap, or things that really, really matter. Like, there's not a next phase of battle if we don't have that basic infrastructure of life. So that feels to me like, all I could do is get as far as saying that. But that seems to me that demands at least a conversation between people of goodwill about, well, what then does it mean for us to arrange ourselves as a mass force against that capital that has already said bye-bye? I used to need you as a mass workforce, but the time of that kind of mass workforce is different now. Now I need loads of people spread all over the place, and I don't care what happens to you lot over here. You're last century's news. Yeah. So that, I did promise on Twitter there'd be some fun, and I think there will be some fun. But I think first we have to talk about the terrible stuff. So that is what...
Even Friday evenings we can do something serious.
That's what I had to say, I think.
Maybe I can pick up a couple of things and then see what you have to say, and then we'll rewind into the audience and so on and so forth. I want to puppet your modesty, which doesn't come to me as easily, but it should. But my book's also completely scattergun. And I think largely I disavow half of it insofar as I think it's read as nationalism. And I want to pick up, it's not the myth-busting and the jingoism that was my preoccupation, but it gets read as such because I think inadvertently I wrote it as that. So why is nationalism bad? Oh, because it excludes people. Or why is nationalism bad? It must be racist. Or why is nationalism bad? Because it's other someone. And we can get if we can just unpack that rationality, then a glorious humanity will get restored or released. Increasingly, I think, because of platformization and the this extraordinarily vast hubbed assemblage can take shape without the nation state. Similarly, some of these arrangements are supranational. Similarly, some of these arrangements are international. We can disaggregate a lot that would happen without nationalism. That nationalism for me increasingly is now a preoccupation because unfortunately the vast majority of people in this world aren't othered by nationalism, and they have the good fortune, I would say, still say misfortune, but the good fortune of thinking they belong to their national majority. That is to say, most people in this world are national majorities scattered across the global population. And the real task for me increasingly, and it's very hard to unpack, is not that the bad things would happen in spite or with nationalism, but rather that people envisage their political community as nations. That is to say, nation has a monopoly, a modernist monopoly, a romanticist monopoly, and a post-neoliberal monopoly on our sense of political community. That in spite of, you were saying, Britain is an infrastructural collapse. I know I hate it when it has a sneer to it when people say the third worldification, and we don't like that kind of inherited colonial moral economy, obviously. But sometimes it is mildly revealing that there's this kind of, what is that bank, that Danish very kind of hedge venture capitalist bank in Denmark that's quite well known. And the guy made a little note. They do this market analysis notes. It's meant only for internal circulation. He goes, oh yeah, Britain, emerging economy. Like on their algorithmic tabulation, Britain, or as the FT had this fantastic piece the other day, I mean, again, a bit controversial, but he goes, Britain isn't a rich country, it's a poor country with some rich people. That is to say, it has pockets of extraordinary world-leading capital locations, but it doesn't have a national life anymore. That the social velocity of that capital doesn't travel. Colonial industrial capital, yes. The East Indian Company traveled to the cotton mills in Lancashire and created the wage proletariat or the wage aristocracy. Today, if the city of London is the cash till of the world, it stays there. It doesn't have a social velocity. It doesn't remake the nation in its own image of dominance.
But isn't the point that most places now
are
that, which is what Ruthie is meaning, isn't it?
That's right.
That how capital is remaking itself alongside human populations now is these little nodules of the super rich with some people to service them around it, and the rest of us in kind of this flux of survival.
But that's why the nationalist question, this is maybe my slight asterisk on Marxism. This is why, for me, nationalism increasingly becomes an imaginative cultural question. That it is fundamentally about our drafting of political belonging, our political community, and indeed that we have all been disentitled. Of course, the migrant is likely the one to be first disentitled upon the very arrival, that they carry no entitlements with them, but the national majority has been under a steady course of disentitlement. But then there is a psychosis that plays out in that there is a melancholia, that there's a revanchism, that there's a self-hatred, a masochism that gets externalized as sadism. That is to say, my life is shit, but my injury is more noble than yours. My injury, my pain, my grievance has national legitimacy. And all it wishes for is a staging of that national legitimacy. Not that it will get sorted, not that it will get relieved, not that it will get ameliorated. Of course, this might be different in the Gulf states. Obviously, you have a rich population of a very small citizenry who expects to remain rich on the back of all these workers. But in Britain, I don't think the political rationality works on those terms. It is rather a theatre of grievance. But unfortunately, nationalism has this extraordinary way of not promising riches in the 21st century, but as promising the dignity of your grievance, as they're promising the dignity of your pain, amplified as an addiction machine. There is some kind of extraordinary enjoyment in this suffering, providing yours is righteous and everyone else is undeserving. Everyone else's pain is invalid, illegitimate, inauthentic, interlopers, deracinated. That, for me, there in the nationalism, we don't need nationalism anymore, I don't think, for the 21st century to do a lot of what you're talking about. But it cuts at the heart of any political question we might have about why might people disidentify and understand their pains. And I think Ben Rogalli's asking us, Ben Rogalli has
got a shout out. You and Ruthie Gilmore got a shout out.
That book is probably here somewhere too.
Yes, it is.
Not actually Ben.
No, but you know him.
Well, we had to make kin connections. His city, I like the title because it's called Migrant City, but the interviews are half the time about workers in England. And he tries to re-narrate through quite patient oral histories how they might see themselves as migrant. That they didn't move because they wanted to, but because of some kind of coercion or contingent where they had to move, or the reverse, that they couldn't move because they were trapped by quite soul-destroying and alienating work, of course, but the necessity of that work. And then to see in the shadow of the migrant who works in the warehouse some self-recognition, That nation can't do the explanatory work for you that you need it to do. It can, of course, make a righteous victim out of you, and that is very seductive. And we know we live in a time of kind of mass amplified victimhoods competing for legitimacy. Not legitimacy that can barter with the state, because what are they going to do? Not legitimacy that can barter with law, because law is in a moment of reinvention. But a legitimacy that can barter with a symbolic economy, that you are the only victim here, and you can dwell in the pleasure and pain of that. That's a different thing. And that nationalism is replete and has been reheated well beyond anything I could have envisaged. I know people are quite excited about the Modi getting a bloody nose. But this is the third term. This is the third term where he wins. And it was a remarkably disciplined opposition. I mean, something that Britain is not capable of. There's no way the Lib Dems and Labour and the SNP and Plaid would all arrange, like, withdraw all their candidates under a unitary alliance across, and India is much more fractious, these differences in these parties, stretching from the West Bengal to Tamil Nadu. But that's what they did, only as a strategic position. And still Modi wins. Okay, it's very hard. The polling suggested something extremely morbid, obviously. But I would have never expected this in the 90s, that this kind of nationalism would reign so supreme, but not because I don't think capital needs, but because capital needs it as a way, not need is a difficult word, but the way that politics gets channeled is under these terms, where we no longer have the basis to challenge what's afoot, to understand collectivity in any sense beyond nationalist invitations. And that is tragic, but then we'll build on your anti-citizenship. Do you have answers?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I absolutely hear what you're saying. And we've had this conversation before. I guess my query is why the nation, and isn't any communitarian politics a bit, yes, a bit kind of vulnerable to that? Oh, woe is me. But I also think, I know it's not a straightforward read across, but people need to live.
Yeah.
And that the politics of victimhood is not feeding, housing, clothing, serving them. Now, that doesn't mean that a material offer alone cuts through it, but there is something, I think, at least over the medium term, about what it is for us to survive together and what it is to create or kind of experiment with practices of surviving together that just bypass the idea that somewhere there is a powerful other who can hear my grievance and isn't hearing your grievance anyway. You know, I hear what you're saying about the moment of electoral politics we see ourselves in many, many places. But also even those kind of sectarian politics are not materially serving their vote bank. That feels to me, you know, that doesn't work endlessly.
Can I put it in reverse then? Because I think I entirely agree on those terms. But one thing you and I talk a lot about, and obviously I talk some of you about the same things. I'm going to invoke Raymond Williams again. The counter-materialist offer, obviously that would recover a revivalist of a class consciousness, but beyond the worker maybe in various ways in which we are alienate or rendered impoverished, or our time is stolen from us in so many ways, or our dignities are stolen, as a materialist question. That counter-offer sometimes still reeks of rationality, right?
Yeah.
And it occurs to me that nationalism is so powerful precisely because it's a structure of feeling, that there is something else it's doing. And then, you know, in my writing, it is utterly feeble. Obviously, people think I'm an idiot for writing about something called conviviality. That, people in public street culture, that's kind of cute. And people, there are some interesting TV shows or musics that shape a kind of non-communitarian identity or kind of tableau of pleasure. But that's what I'm trying to get at. Like, conviviality is too small. Multicultural is too small. You can't scale that up for a radical revolutionary politics, obviously. Or it's not self-explanatory. But I think, and obviously Richard is going to do the third installment of this talk, but I think he's increasingly interested in this. oh, nationalism is a distorted structure of passions. And I know
Yeah,
you're
that's-
interested in passion.
I
See
am
what
interested in
mean?
passion, yes.
And so simply structure of feeling materialism,
Yeah.
that can't be it, because this thing is doing its own work.
Yeah.
It doesn't, sometimes it feigns materialist like betterment or improvement, but it's so naked and so thin. I know the Remainiac Brexit thing is well over, but one of the sillier things about the Remainiac was to be completely fetishizing over the 350 on the bus, the 350 million a week on the bus. That wasn't the point. You either think people are so stupid or you think they're staking a different kind of political claim. And I believe they were doing the latter. I don't think people were so silly. And that is, I don't think you think so otherwise. You know what I mean? That, all right, the red bus told us 350 million more for the NHS on a weekly basis. That there's something else about grievance, validity, meaning. I mean, you sent me what's his name? Who is that communitarian in Labour who's not Blue Labour? Cruddas.
Cruddas.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
And you know, you were saying...
Tell you a story about John Cruddas.
He was saying that the populists are turbocharged. What are you laughing about?
I'm just thinking about John Cruddas. Sorry, keep it to myself.
And I don't like him at all, but he was saying like, social democracy is exhausted, that we come back with rationality and they are turbocharged by other things.
Yeah.
By a whole arsenal of like deep meaning, collectivity, belonging, solidarity, camaraderie, peoplehood, the folk. All the things we also like to talk about as Marxists or communists. Togetherness, solidarity, peoplehood, collectivity. But they're doing it in such
In a way that
poetic
works.
charm.
Yeah.
You know? And
But
that's a
they're not
different kind of
really.
Yeah.
Oh, this is kind. You know, so I'm interested in passion, although not in the same way Richard is. Like Richard's interested in the passions, aren't they? But nationalism, as we have known it recently and across Europe, is a kind of distortion of people's wish for a passionate public life and the most thin strip of it. People don't walk around, even racists don't walk around Britain thinking I'm
about
full
the
of
nation.
passion. They think about their football team, or they think about who they fancy in the pub, or their mates, or their, that's where the emotional register of togetherness is, and the deepness, and kind of everyone knows it, and yet that is not amenable, certainly to an electoral politics, but it might be a better place to start thinking about what a structure of feeling of commonality and collectivity is. So that bypasses, okay, we are not going to have a story that out Farage's Farage. You know, we need to stop that. There's no point. We're not going to, whatever we say, however many pictures of the NHS in its birth moment, that it's not a thing that does that, because that structure of feeling in electoral politics, as you say, it's a kind of dissing of rationalism and instrumentalism, and that actually even mild social democracy is a highly rational and instrumentalist politics. Rightly, I think, because how is she going to plan for everyone to, even if that's, for some of us that's a kind of tactic and some of us that's our horizon, but still, it's basically, how do you do a big bureaucracy and everyone get what they want? That's not going, that's not going to compete with people saying, oh, the small boats. We're in different places. But we could still think together about where people's passions are and how that interacts with their material needs and their affective connections with others, both close and far. And that feels to me like that's a better place to start a discussion for the left.